Welcome to On the Agenda, the podcast version of Agenda Alexandria. We're going to talk about growth, development, height limits, bonus height, bonus density. It's a lot of stuff to get into, but we've got a great guest joining us to go through all of these things. He is a journalist who covers economic development and real estate for the Washington Business Journal and an Alexandria resident, Dan Brandel. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so I want to start on Mount Vernon Avenue in Delray. There is a building there, the Human Services Building, that is, may be redeveloped. There was the new owner of the site had a proposal that they started to shop around to the local neighborhood groups, and they got so much pushback because they wanted to essentially double the existing height there. And there was so much neighborhood opposition. A new group was formed called Save Delray. And now, as of last weekend, the lawyer representing the developer said the whole thing is on ice and we're going to put this thing on pause because there's been so much pushback. So, Dan Brandel, I know in your time as a journalist covering these things, there's always this tension between developers and what developers want, and then neighborhood groups and what neighborhood groups want, right? So what do you make of this situation in Delray, and how does that sort of fit in with how these things normally work or don't work?
Well, I cover real estate deals all over the Washington, D.C. region, and it sounds pretty par for the course for me. Whenever there's, and I make no value judgment about whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, but whenever there's any major change proposed, pretty much of any kind, whether that's bigger buildings, taller buildings, major changes of use or whatever, there's always going to be agitation among the neighbors. So this doesn't sound like anything unusual.
Yeah, well, in this particular case, the agitation was successful to the extent that the developer has now, put this thing on hold. So not dead quite yet, but certainly the opposition was heard and acted upon. But that discussion about the site on Mount Vernon Avenue opened up kind of a Pandora's box about height limits and zoning and bonus density and the relationship between affordable housing and the rules the city sets forward. So I want to explore some of those things. One of the topics of discussion that emerged out of all of the talk on what the developer wanted to do on Mount Vernon Avenue, there was a lot of discussion about Alexandria's bonus height program. So what the city has this existing program where developers can go beyond the current height limits if they deliver affordable housing units. So the current existing bonus height program is that if you're a developer, you can go higher than the height limits say that you should go in exchange for delivering 1/3 of the units that you're going to build as affordable housing units. So you got to make the math work, in terms of what you can afford, what you can deliver, what the city, wants. Dan, is this something that we've seen jurisdictions across our region sort of move toward, this idea of allowing bonus height in exchange for affordable housing units?
So bonus height and bonus density are a kind of a way of incentivizing affordable housing that I've heard described as value capture. So a local government, one of its unique powers is to control land use, like what's allowed to be built or not built where. And so in a really high demand place like Alexandria or Arlington, parts of Fairfax, whatever, lots of people want to live there. There's developers want to go higher and bigger because there would be people to fill, like they want that because people want that. Maybe not the incumbent people who live there probably don't want that, but that's what people, the market, want. There would be enough people to fill those extra apartments. That's why they want to do it. And
or
so
even future people. I mean, one thing that I've noticed as a tension in terms of interest groups, when you talk about zoning decisions and land use decisions, is you're weighing lots of things against each other. There's the concerns of the existing neighborhood But then, sometimes you also have to consider, well, what about future generations? What about future people who don't live here yet that might live here in the future? Like, is that an interest group that we should be thinking about or be concerned about?
Yeah, and that's actually the way I would personally characterize it. And again, I don't mean any value judgment here, one way or the other, but I don't think it's very factually accurate when people characterize the when the narrative is one against of residents versus developers. What developers want? Developers don't want anything they can't sell. And the only reason they can sell it is because, as you put it, future residents want to be future residents. So I'd think it's more accurately characterized as incumbent residents versus future ones or prospective ones. If future residents want, but they're not doing it because there's no demand. If there weren't a demand, they wouldn't do it. But
well, there's demand for housing. I mean, that's, I think, what's
that's what I'm
accelerating a
saying,
lot of this
right?
discussion. And in terms of desirable areas,
And
Mount Vernon Avenue is
demand is just
pretty
another
desirable.
demand is just another word for what people want, right? So that's why I say I don't know that I would characterize it so much as what developers want as developers responding to what people want.
The free hand of the market guiding the developers.
So your question about bonus height and bonus density, those are called value capture things. So when a local government allows a developer to tap into that demand by building bigger, by building more apartments or condos that produce more revenues, like that's the attraction to the developer. It's the argument goes that the government has created value essentially out of thin air, right, for the developer. So in exchange for that developer, we want you to give us back some of that created value that we allowed you to have that you otherwise wouldn't have in the form of some public good. Often that's affordable housing. It's an important tool for affordable housing advocates, but it's been used for other things too. I think even in part of
North Old
Old
Town, I think, has
Town
a program for
for the
art.
arts, right?
Mhm.
So, and I remember hearing discussion at one point in Alexandria. I don't think anything ever came of it, of using bonus density to incentivize various green building kind of things. So you could use it to incentivize any kind of public good. I have generally seen it for affordable housing. I think that's usually what it's reserved for. But yes, things like that are not, to answer your question, things like that are not necessarily uniform everywhere, but they're certainly not uncommon in jurisdictions around the region.
And so I'm curious also about the reaction to the use of bonus height, bonus density, or even the discussion about potentially using bonus height and bonus density, because, like, what the conversation around this now paused development on Mount Vernon Avenue was that it was going to change the character of Del Rey. And so there was a group called Save Del Rey that was created that said to the point for the city government was, you're going to destroy the historic character of Del Rey. So, I mean, I think, that's at the micro level. On a larger level, frequently when you talk about growth and development or land use decisions, you often hear this thing about, like, if you build this building, people will come. Our streets will be crowded. We won't be able to find parking. Our schools will be overcrowded. And so it's like, by allowing all this development, you're changing the nature of the city that we live in, right? So how do elected officials sort of square that circle where they say, we got all this demand for housing, we got to meet it. We got demands for affordable housing, we need to meet that. But we got all these residents who say, don't you dare change the character of the city that we live in. Like, so what's an elected official to do in that circumstance?
It probably depends on if they want to get elected again. I don't know that a lot of elected officials really do square the circle. I mean, it's widely agreed that there's. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I heard the term affordable housing crisis or housing crisis, it's a crisis, right? That narrative is orthodoxy in the region.
Well, but it is a crisis, right? Or would you take issue with the use of that word?
No, not necessarily. I'm just saying that the tools to solve these problems. I mean, housing. I don't claim to be a housing expert. I don't claim to be an economist, but I've reported on it for a number of years, and I have to say that while housing, just like any policy subject, can get very complicated in the details, sure. The big broad brushstrokes of it really aren't that difficult, right? It comes down to money. It comes down to, can you get enough revenues on the back end of a project, through rents or sales, to pay for the financing of building the project in the first place. Which, when you live in a really expensive place like the DC region or many metropolitan regions, land is very expensive. Building underground parking is very expensive. So if you can't do it with volume on the back end, then you have to do it with price, right? So the way to solve these problems, the tools that are available to policymakers are really not unknown. Again, I want to be really careful to not be making a value judgment, but I think if they wanted to solve the problem, it's not a question of not knowing how. They know how. They have a quiver of arrows that they could use, and those are pretty well known. You could subsidize it. You could speed up entitlement processes to save developers money. You could reduce parking requirements to reduce the cost of building underground parking, so on and so forth. But it all comes down to money. And if there were political will, then they would do it.
So you mentioned
probably because there's not political will.
You mentioned tools that are available, and that's a good segue into a related topic of discussion, which is that bonus height program that currently exists. There has been talk for quite some time of expanding that. So the way it works now is the bonus height program is available in a very limited number of zones. If you think about the zoning map of Alexandria, so in very limited spaces, the city's saying to developers, sure, you can build higher than the height limit. We're fine with that. But as long as the exchange is that you deliver 1/3 of the units that you build will be affordable housing, dedicated affordable housing units. That's the exchange for the bonus height program, the existing bonus height program. What the city's now considering is we're going to expand that. Instead of the limited number of zones, we're going to make it much more available in many of other zones that it's currently not available in, including Mount Vernon Avenue, which is the site that got everybody so hot and bothered about all of this. So, I mean, you talked about the tools that are available. How should policymakers think about expanding where a bonus height program is available? In other words, I'm not asking you to say whether it's good or bad, but what should they be thinking about when they're considering whether or not they want to expand the number of zones where the developer can take advantage of this bonus height?
I guess I'd say that just like pretty much any decision in politics, right, it would come down to articulating and weighing the trade-offs. If you want affordable housing, units where rents are kind of contractually capped below the market rate, targeting some particular income group, which is usually what people mean by affordable housing. Well, there's only so many ways you're gonna achieve that, right? You can do it by allowing the value creation kind of mechanisms we talked about, and then capture some of that value, such as in a bonus density or bonus height program. You can subsidize it. You can speed up the entitlement process to save developers money. You see that sort of thing for Montgomery County, for example, up in Maryland, does a speed to market thing where they fast track applications for life science related developments. Well, that fast
Dan, I know that you cover
Montgomery
County. I know that you cover Montgomery County. Didn't their entire planning board just recently resign? What's going on with that?
Yeah, it did. The county the local governments work differently in Maryland than they do in Virginia, but basically the local legislature lost confidence in its planning board, and as a result, the planning board agreed to resign, and that came out of allegations that, to my knowledge, have not been proven, but a number of allegations against different people about various, things they shouldn't have been doing, drinking in the office and things like that.
Oh, I was expecting there to be conflict of interest or corruption. I mean, this is just sort of base.
Yeah, so there was one
behavior,
allegation of the And again, I don't know that any of these things have been substantiated yet. I think they're being investigated. There was an allegation of the planning board chair um, having and sharing alcohol uh, in his office, creating a toxic work environment by raising his voice and using misogynistic language. There was an allegation against somebody else for ethics related violations. I don't know the details, having to do with a previous investigation. So it was quite something. I don't know that there's a whole lot of precedent in recent memory for an entire political body like that resigning. It's a pretty big deal for them.
It is a pretty big deal. That's
Yeah.
why I wanted to know more about it. So
So,
going back to this. Oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
oh no. So to just round out your last questions, the trade-offs, right? So if you don't want to subsidize it, then you probably need to. If you want affordable housing, and you've decided that's what you want, then you can only do it so many ways. If you don't want to subsidize it with public money, then you can allow greater density, or you can use public, you can basically gift public land. Fairfax County is doing a deal right now where they're ground leasing public land for a very small amount. That amount reduces the cost for developers, allows them to have more affordable rents on the back end because they have less to finance on the front end. Or you can speed it, but you got to do something, or don't have affordable housing, right? Like that's the political choice. But you can't have everything. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So I guess that's, to answer your questions, what are politicians to do? Oh, they're to lay out the trade-offs before them and choose, or don't, right? But you can't have affordable housing if you don't choose something.
It's interesting if you think about every city council election cycle that I've ever seen. The top issue is always affordable housing, because like the candidate makes a promise of expanding affordable housing, and then in campaigns, you don't really get an opportunity to get at the nitty gritty of, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean that you take your bonus height limit and extend it to RM zoning that it currently doesn't exist in? I mean, like, you don't really get to that level of detail in a campaign. I've tried. It doesn't campaigns don't work that way. But like now that they're actually involved in the business of government, they need to figure out, you know, where they want to draw the line. And then you have all these people saying, don't change the nature, don't change the character of the city that I live in. Like I would imagine this is something that's not clearly it's not specific to Alexandria, right? I'm sure you've got areas all over our region that are telling their local governments, don't screw up the character of this place that I moved here. Like there's a reason why I moved here, and it's not because it's so hugely dense and has all these people and has all this traffic. And if you allow this bonus density, if you allow this bonus height, it's going to screw up the reason I moved here, right? I mean, like I'm sure you're hearing this all around the region, I would imagine.
Oh, I think that happens all around the country and probably all around the world, right? I'm sure if you tried to build some massive skyscraper in Paris, the Parisians wouldn't like it.
Well, you're talking about highly desirable metropolitan areas. I would imagine if you went to Bedford and you said, I'm going to build a Walmart that's denser than the zoning allowed, they'd be happy with building the Walmart.
Oh, I don't know about that. My grandmother used to live in a rural part of California where they big box stores were their version of tall buildings, right?
Yeah,
like
I hear what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Anything that changes, I don't know that it's unusual at all that people would generally not be super jazzed about any kind of change, whether good or bad. I don't know, but I don't think it's unusual that large groups of people are going to be adverse to change.
So who are the interest groups here that are worth thinking about and worth listening to? I mean, if you think about expanding bonus height as an example, there are the neighborhood groups like Save Del Rey that would say that's changing the historic nature of Del Rey, and that's what we moved to Del Rey because it's a specific thing. If you allow more height and more density and more people, it's going to screw it up. So that's an interest group. And then you've got the developers and the money that they could make, which, as you pointed out earlier, is actually just a reflection of the free market capitalism system that we live in. So they're actually representing the demand of the market. So those are two interest groups. What are the other important interest groups that we should be thinking about here in this discussion?
I guess of the prospective residents, I would really zero in on the lower the lower income ones who would be the target of affordable housing, right? Some of these people
That's a good point. Okay, so as an
probably,
interest group, the people who would otherwise be kicked out of Alexandria because they couldn't afford to live here.
or they, I mean, I'm sure there are tons of people living in Alexandria who they do live there. They're just paying a lot of money relative to their income in order to do it. Um, the lower down the income ladder you go, invariably you're going to find people spending 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of their disposable income on rent, right? So if you're that person, well, that sucks, right? So I would specifically, I guess, kind of zero in on that interest group, renters specifically, and low income renters even more specifically. That's just a subset of the kind of demand interest group that you already talked about. But and then, I mean, there are I'm sure you could run down the rabbit hole of the interests that finance these things. Low income housing tax credits is a federal tax program that's kind of the big kahuna in terms of um, subsidizing affordable housing. So those are, you know, those investors who would get to write off, or get to reduce their tax liability through those kind of credits, would have an interest in these sort of projects.
Let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit, Dan. One of the reactions you often hear from people in Alexandria, I hear this from our members at Agenda Alexandria, is a distrust of developers that don't build affordable housing but contribute to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And for some reason, a lot of people look at that situation and the perception is you're not really doing anything for affordable housing. You're just throwing money at it. But then the way it actually works is that money goes into a fund where you've got developers that specialize in affordable housing, like Wesley. We're going to have someone on our panel next week that's from Wesley Development. And they use those tax credits you were just talking about to build massive project, well, not massive, to build projects that contribute substantially to the stock of affordable housing in Alexandria, right? I mean, like in fact, there in the last, like, say 10 years, there have been any number of developments that have been created. A lot of them have been on religious, what used to be religious sites that have affordable housing units constructed on them using those tax credits you were just talking about, and all the money that they get from the developers that have not contributed to the affordable housing stock, but they've got the money to build the units. Like, I mean, we've seen these on the West End. I think we've seen a number of these things. So, I mean, there are ways to move all this stuff around, right? So, like the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, in your experience, what have you seen come out of that? And is that something? I mean, how do other areas deal with this trust fund issue?
I think generally speaking, affordable housing advocates think that a housing trust fund is one of the single most important, policy or funding tools that a municipal jurisdiction could have in order to tackle the affordable housing project.
You say one of the
Problem.
most, even more than like a bonus height program, for example.
I mean, I think some of that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I've talked to some different people, think different things about which one's the best, but almost anybody is going to tell you that you can't hang your hat on one peg. You need all these different tools in the toolbox is the metaphor of choice usually, right? But different people will think differently about which are the most decisive. But a trust fund is just, I mean, it's a fund that would be used to provide what's usually called gap financing for projects, meaning filling the gap between like regular conventional private financing and tax credit type of stuff. And I suppose a jurisdiction could replenish that trust fund however it wanted to, whether out of its general fund or taking fees or contributions from developers or whatever, or some combination. One argument I've heard in favor of not necessarily having on-site affordable housing units, but rather having the developer put cash into this account or this fund, is that if you're trying to build housing in a really expensive place, well, you could theoretically take the money that would build, say it would build 5 affordable units in a really expensive part of Delray or Old Town. Well, maybe that same amount of money could go someplace in the city where land is cheaper, and you could build 8 units with the same amount of money or something like that. So one side of the argument is saying that you could that the flexibility a local government has with cash is that it can deploy that cash where it can get the most bang for its buck in terms of like the number of units. On the other hand, you're probably getting those units in, by definition, a less desirable part of town. That's why it's cheaper, so I don't know which is better. That's a trade-off, right? You want more units in a less desirable part of town, or more low-income people living in a more desirable part of town to achieve some sort of socioeconomic diversity there. Those are all trade-offs that have to be weighed politically.
Let me go back to the expanding the zones where you can use the height bonus. Right now, it's available in a very limited number of zones. There is a discussion and potential for expanding that dramatically. So all over the city, you might see higher buildings in exchange for affordable housing units. What's the downside of that? I mean, like, clearly there's lots of opposition among neighborhood groups about, historic character, whatever. Like, actually, let me ask you this way. What is the upside of the downside? So, like, what is actually before the decision makers who have to evaluate the pros and cons here? Like, what are they thinking about? What issues are they working through to make a decision on that?
Probably, and I apologize, I'm not going to remember the details offhand, but you should go look it up, or listeners should go look it up. Probably the single best, and I've reported in Alexandria some years ago. I reported in Southern California, where I moved after that. Now I'm reporting in the DC area, having moved back. And in those years, the single best articulation of the choices before policymakers, the trade-offs we've been talking about, was when Alexandria some years ago did what it called at the time, I believe, was its Route 1 South affordability plan. Does that ring a bell to you?
It does, yeah.
Where there were, and here, forgive me if I don't recollect the details exactly, but anybody interested in the subject should go look it up. There was I believe there were federal subsidies. The contracts on them were expiring, and the city was going to lose whatever number it was. I forget, 100 units of affordable housing or something like that when these contracts expired. But they didn't want to. They said, we want to maintain affordability in this area. So what are our choices? And the city staff created a report and study, as they always do. And the choices that they articulated were, if memory serves, that you can either triple the amount of allowable density here in order to create that value that kind of then is captured, right? Or you could subsidize it with, and here I forget the number, but it was some absolutely untenable, $90 million over some period of time, like some dollar figure that the city of Alexandria could never in a million years afford, right? If it still wanted to meet all of its other obligations, or don't do it, right? Like, those were the choices, like lose affordability here, triple the density, or put tens of millions of dollars towards subsidizing it under its current, capped density. That was it. Those were the choices. And so I thought that was very helpful in the report. And the choice wasn't framed in a way that said one is right or one is wrong. It was just a very clear, crisp, you can either do it with dollars, you can do it with density, or you cannot do it. But you got to pick something. You can't have it all. I thought that was a very nice way to articulate it for policymakers and also voters and, citizens who don't have all day, every day to spend wading through the jargon of land use planning and affordable housing kind of stuff, right? So I guess the upside to your question, what's the upside to the downside of having more density, is that it allows you to have affordable housing without subsidizing it. And those subsidies have trade-offs, right? You can only get that money. The definition of a budget is that you have a finite amount of money, right? So if you're going to spend it on X, that means you're not spending it on Y, or it means you have to raise taxes to make more money. right? So if the choice is not raising taxes or not cutting the transfer to the public schools or whatever else the city government would have to do in order to subsidize affordable housing, well, that's the upside, I guess.
So a couple times you have mentioned the tools in the toolbox, right? So, which I recognize is an idiom of sorts, but I'm wondering if there are any tools out there that Alexandria doesn't have, either because the General Assembly hasn't given them to Alexandria or Alexandria hasn't taken the initiative of creating them and obtaining them. I mean, I guess what I'm really asking is, have you seen in your look at the Washington region and even in Southern California, are there other things out there Alexandria could be doing that they're not doing or haven't even thought about?
I would probably think it's more an issue of magnitude than I would be very suspicious of anybody who tells you that there's some like magical bullet out there that no one's discovered. And if only we discover that extra tool to add into our toolbox. I think it's more an issue of, you allow a little bit of extra density. Well, if you want even more affordable housing, then allow a lot more density, or you subsidize it a little bit. If you want a lot more, then you're gonna have to subsidize it a lot more. Washington, D.C. in our region is famous for dumping enormous amounts of money into affordable housing, so far more than any other jurisdiction in the region. But they're also
No,
famous
wait,
for having very limited building
say
heights.
that one more time. I didn't quite know that.
Washington, D.C. Gives quite a lot of money to affordable housing subsidization directly. They're not super keen on the density or height aspect of it. Washington, D.C. very famously has a pretty short skyline if you compare it to other major cities like Chicago or New York or something. And that's by choice, right? There's a federal law that caps the heights of buildings in the district itself, the municipal government, I think even goes above and beyond that in terms of restricting building size, right? So they're not doing a whole lot of the value creation and capture approach to affordable housing, but they're doing the subsidize the snot out of it method. So I would say it's probably an issue of magnitude. I think the Alexandria and every other jurisdiction here is probably mixing and matching the various tools at its disposal within their political contexts. If they want more affordable housing, they can do those things more. If they don't, then they won't. But it probably comes down to just choosing that versus whatever else you would have to trade off to get it.
All right. So one last question. I really appreciate your time, Dan Brandel of the Washington Business Journal. So the update here for our listeners to Agenda Alexandria is the developer, Bonaventure, that was thinking about building a redevelopment at the Human Services site that is twice as high as the current building. That's on ice. That has been put on hold because of pushback from the community. Meanwhile, the thing that is kind of active and the thing that people are talking about is expanding the areas in the city where developers can get a height bonus and build higher than the limits in exchange for delivering affordable housing units, which is controversial, by the way. Some people think that's a great idea. Some people think that's a horrible idea. Dan Brandel, this is the last question I'll throw to you, which is, how do we know if it's a good idea or not? Maybe this is a lousy idea. Like, how do we evaluate whether or not expanding the areas where you could get bonus height is a good idea or a bad idea?
I'm sure the city staff would be able to come up with would be able to research comparable things that have been done elsewhere in the region or nationally, and hopefully get some sort of empirical basis for whether it works or not. But I mean, isn't that the measure of anything? Like, did it work? If you allow this tool, there's not, the government by allowing more bonus height places, the local government would not be mandating larger buildings. All they would be doing is giving developers the option to build taller in exchange for giving back some affordable housing, right? A developer doesn't have to do that. And if they determine in their market analyses that there's no demand for it, then they won't do it, right? So the city government could be way overly optimistic about demand in the city. It could allow this tool, and then no developer uses it. I doubt that would be the case, but I think you would have to just see if you did this thing and then 3 years later, 5 years later, whatever, come back and measure it. Like, did you get more than you would have gotten otherwise? Did you set out to get affordable housing? Did it work? Or has it worked elsewhere?
On that note, sounds like a great place to leave it. I want our listeners to know that we've got a great Agenda Alexandria panel planned for this upcoming Monday, October 24th. Important to point out, it's at the Lyceum on South Washington Street in Old Town, not at the Masonic Memorial. We have been meeting in recent times at the George Washington Masonic Memorial. We're not meeting there on Monday, October 24th. We're meeting at the Lyceum on South Washington Street in Old Town. And we're talking about all these issues of growth and development and height and affordable housing and the bonus density and the height density. We'll talk about all of that. And we've got a amazing panel. We will be joined by the city manager of Alexandria, Jim Parajon, is joining us. We're also going to be joined by the founder of the group Save Del Rey, which I talked about earlier on this podcast. Nate Hurto is joining us. And we are also going to be joined by Camilla McAfee, who is Senior Vice President for Wesley Housing, one of these groups that takes all that money from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and turns it into affordable housing. So we've got all manners of this discussion covered for this panel discussion on Monday, October 24th. Dan, you going to join us there at the Lyceum?
I'd love to. Thanks.
Great. Well, I appreciate your time, Dan. Dan Brandel of the Washington Business Journal. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people. The people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.